Yeah, no, I think all's well. I'm David. And I've written about 120 pages or so about our trip, but tonight we'll just deal with the photos and the images, I think. We'll be here all night. So, canoes, I didn't know much about these canoes, and everything happened fairly quickly in terms of a learning curve. That's it, just click on there. Well, there's Harry, and we've had a wonderful tribute to him. And I'd like to acknowledge not just Harry, but also John and the museum in the way they helped me to actually go and do this amazing trip and come back with the amazing information and what I was able to do with it. Without their help, and also without the help of 5 other people who came along with us to help with the charter costs of the vessel. One of them's here tonight, Fred's here. All that helped actually make something happen that really, in a sense, needed to happen. Harry's there in a little village down at Sud-Est Island, actually, with the crowd around him, including Fred and Isabel, meeting up with the elders and talking about all sorts of fascinating pieces that they've brought along. But where things kind of begin is when you start to do some research and find out, well, what have people done in terms of recording these craft earlier on? And what we found actually was the best examples, the best drawings, the best information available on canoes in this area of New Guinea came from 1849 in the Rattlesnake survey expedition. These drawings come from the State Library of New South Wales, where all of Oswald Brearley's beautiful artwork has been kept. I've actually seen the originals and photographed some of them. But what they had were beautiful artist representations of a number of boats, details, a lot of landscapes, a lot of different pieces of information. But it still didn't cover everything, because what our voyage is shown here in blue in 2 different parts. Where Rattlesnake went through is they started at Rossel, came through here, through to Sud-Est and so forth, and then followed the Calvados chain along there, because basically they were surveying the reef. That was their job. They had scientists on board and they had Brearley, and they felt very frustrated in that they couldn't actually do as much work as they wanted to do. But he certainly recorded a number of boats. And what we found between that period of 1849 until when we went on there were a number of sort of, I guess we'd call it schematic drawings of the boats. They weren't really done correctly to scale. They often missed a lot of information because they just captured the basics of it. There didn't seem to be a lot in terms of detail. And that, in a sense, was my lucky break. We went on board the MV Curringa. This is an ex-Australian trawler boat that Murray Abel's son Tim, was it Chris Abel's son? That's Murray's son Tim, had turned into a charter boat. He was going to use it for backpackers. We got to take it on the very first trip and gave it sea trials by taking it as far away from Alatal as we could, and then seeing if we could get it back. This was a challenge, I can assure you, and just made the whole trip really something to be special to be part of. And there's the banana boat that came along with us, the skiff. There's Isabel, there's Luke, there's Harry. He hasn't got that shirt, Fred, sorry, he hasn't got that shirt tonight, I'm disappointed. That's Louis with his back to us. Phil, the other fellow, unfortunately, is not in that photo. But we had barely arrived. Like, we got off the plane and Harry's waiting for us at the hotel we're staying at, saying, we can go out and look at a war canoe this afternoon at a village nearby. So I grabbed my measuring stuff and off we went with our sandwiches in the van. And lo and behold, we were allowed into a shed to look at these canoes. We were given permission. I was given permission to actually measure them. That's one of the most important things. You don't just do things, you actually ask about whether you can do things. And they were happy enough to allow me to take measurements off that canoe there. And Harry and I actually went back the next day because there was a mix-up. The fellow who was supposed to meet us there, the head of the village, wasn't, but he was there the next day. So we went back and had a really good conversation with him to find out a lot more details about them. So the first thing I was able to do was actually eventually produce this drawing. This is to scale 1 to 20. The size of that original drawing is AO, so it's over 1 metre long. And this was kind of what I was sent to do. I was asked, could I actually measure these boats up and produce accurate drawings of these? And I said, I can, you've just got to lead me to it. And I will produce these things. And I've done it all by drawing out a string line and doing things essentially by hand. And a couple of other photos will show you actually how all this came to be. But these are amazing boats in their own, before we get on to the outrigger canoes. Beautifully carved. You saw how that one was being carved up in the back, up the hill and then brought down to the water. And everything's kind of right about it. The shape and so on. It's meant for sitting down. It's meant for speed. It's got a curved shape to it in a way. When you look at the way this line comes in on itself here, that just makes it easier to paddle. You don't brace your arms on the edge of the boat. It kind of brings itself back in on itself. It's using the natural shape of the wood. All this is really well thought out. This is a beautiful boat. And the other thing to note is this is the root end of the tree, and at the front, the bow, that's the top end of the trunk. So it's narrow, it's got a taper. And they use that taper so that the bigger people sit down the back where there's more volume in the boat. The lighter people are up the front. The captain, the fellow that's steering it, standing up down the back. So you actually need the bigger part of that volume down the back to get the boat to trim correctly. These people have all sorted these things out by probably a little bit of trial and error, but certainly it just evolves. So that's one of the key points I wanted to get across, that the technology is very, very good. It might look a little bit rough, but if we were designing a boat, that's exactly how we would come out with the same answer of distributing the volume and making the boat fast and elegant for what it's got to do. We get on now to the outrigger canoes. And again, I want to talk a little bit of technology first and bring this up now rather than sort of talk about it later, but I will refer to it from time to time. The boats, the very simple dugout boats, come from a log, and you shape that log. It's basically got its shape, and you give it a bow and a stern and make it flow through the water quite nicely as best you can. And that log by itself will actually support the weight of the people in the boat. You don't need anything else, but you can put some washboards in to give it a little bit more freeboard. It's a very simple way of making a boat. But what I found with the Massim boats was that they're all basically done on what's called a dugout keel with plank sides, which is taking technology a couple of steps further, in fact, a long way further to actually come up with this. It involves making sure you've got watertight seams with your connections because they're going to be underwater and they're potentially leaking. You've got to shape parts of the wood. You've got to do a lot of work and think it out beforehand and set it up correctly to make it actually happen. Whereas the dugout log, basically find the biggest tree that'll do it, dig it out as best you can, then find out what it'll support. But here you've got to plan things in advance. And what I also found was this dugout keel hull with the plank sides just seemed to be a type of boat that fitted in with the Massim area, the islands that we were going through. When you go either side of that, you go back to dugout logs, things like that. It started to show me there's something quite unique happening in here. And when I was talking with Ben Shaw, who studied Massim and still is, and written quite a number of papers about it, he sort of mentioned something else. He said, no, there's definitely things happening. There's something enclosed about the society in a lot of what it does. And what you've just told me about the boats is another concept, another thing that's reinforcing that within themselves, they certainly did a number of special things. I can't tell you how old that technology is. I do know that when they went through and they were looking at those boats in 1849 and later on, they talked about planked up sides. They recorded those sorts of things. They were definitely doing it then. Whether any earlier influences come in to show them what to do or whether they've gradually sorted it out is something I still can't answer. But it's certainly something that is worth following up, and I wanted to highlight now. So the first thing we looked at was actually the contemporary canoes. There's a particular type of these outrigger canoes called the sailor that was basically developed in the 1930s. We found a couple of different stories about this, but when it gets down to reading a couple of them, you find it sort of gels that they linked up with the influence happened in the 1930s when Papua New Guinea people who'd been in Australia came back, brought with them the ideas of the lugger rig, which is basically the biggest change. They changed to this simple rig of a mast with the sail on that particular side of the hull, which is the outboard side, the leeward side, and set it up with yards, and it's a synthetic sail. Before that, they'd been using woven ones. So they came up with this particular boat, which has got a fairly simplified version of the carvings and so forth. And, but it still reflects a lot of what these boats are about. So my first opportunity to record one of those was at Panapompom Island. We'd gone through the Louisiade area in that map that I showed you briefly beforehand. We'd gone through the Louisiades, the Calvados and so on first, which is where the Sailor were. And then later on, we did the northern trip around the Trobriands and over to Woodlark and so on. But the first time we finally stopped at Panapompom Island in the De Boyne Lagoon, we were allowed ashore to measure up this particular sailor. There's a photograph on the right there of me actually doing measuring. It's on a different boat, but I'm standing in the middle of the boat. I've got a notebook there. I'm scribbling down notes. I've actually created a table, and we're measuring widths of the hull along at the frame stations. I've got the widths, the length the stations are apart. Before that, I've already pulled a string line out and started to develop that as a baseline, what the shape of the boat is in profile. And then I can move that string line to a centre line and get widths and depths from that and gradually work it through. Also, it's important to note the other photo I've shown there of the boat end on, to get an idea of where boats float, because that's important when you're drawing a boat. You've got to put a wall line in there to get some idea of where it's trimmed about. It was just a matter of observation, of looking at the boats all the time, just getting this common idea of where they sat in the water and how they trimmed, so that when I came to do a technical drawing, I could actually draw it out the way that I've taught myself how to do proper naval architectural drawings. This is the sketch I would do very soon after. We would measure these boats. It often seemed to happen in the morning, I seem to remember, more often than not. We would come through and spend a couple of hours, I'd be able to measure it. That would give me the opportunity to come back to the boat, set something up on the saloon and do a sketch at a much smaller scale and just plot all the points that I'd measure and start to develop it and see if I understood it. I could reinforce my writing so that later on I could see it was a 5 and not an 8 or something like that. Just do a whole lot of things I've learned over the years. These are the classic mistakes you'll make if you've measured something and draw it 6 months later and go back to something that you've done before. It gave me a chance to check things too and realise, hang on, I've missed something. We should perhaps go back or double check things and find out, no, I've measured this at a different point and this is what I actually got and that must be the correct answer. There's actually something on this sketch showing me where I've got the centre line for the outrigger out by a certain amount and I need to move it across when I do the final drawing. But I would do this drawing over the afternoon and get everything in there as much as possible so that I knew I'd captured the basics of it and could do the final drawing, which is this. This is a proper naval architect's standard drawing of a boat, how you do the design. At the top, you've got the lines plan, which is all these lines here, which is showing you the shape of the boat. We've got what we call the body plan, the cross sections of the boat. I've drawn it from either end, which is what you typically do on a yacht design or a vessel design plan. And then I've drawn out all the structure of it with a cross section through the middle, which is down here, a plan view looking down on it, and then the thwartships or sections slices through the side of it. And I kind of kept to a similar pattern for all the drawings of putting on one side a drawing at the mast step, which is always a key place, which is the one on this side, and then drawings at one particular frame, at a frame towards the end, and then the washboards. That would capture the essential information because a lot of this is repetitive. Once you've got one frame, the other frames are the same. They're mirror reverse often around a centre line. They're realigned slightly differently. That kind of made it easier to actually get all that information when you're doing this. You just measure one frame and take a whole lot of photographs and then check various things and find out what's subtly different and make notes about that. You don't have to religiously measure every particular frame. And this way you can actually get the information in a reasonable amount of time because this is out in the sun. You've only got a certain amount of time here at the island. We did 27 islands in 30 days. We were going at it. And it was a matter of being economical. Let's get this information down, make sure we got it right, get as many photos as I can and work from there. I've kind of done it before. I just hadn't done it with anything as amazing as this in such extreme circumstances. The other drawing I like to do then is show, well, what's the profile of this? You've got to record the sail plan and record some of the details of how things are actually done. So I would draw out a plan view, a profile view of the boat with the sail set. These all had a pattern that the sail, the boat was set up such that the outrigger stayed on the windward side and the main hull was on the leeward side, the side away from where the wind's blowing. And then the top view, I would show the boat from the outrigger side, so you could get an idea of the proper proportions of the vessel and how it actually looked. And I drew exactly what was in front of me. So there's the graffiti on there that was on that particular boat. There's all the stains of where the paint's coming off. Well, I thought, let's just show these boats what they are. They're living things. We don't really want to embellish them anymore. Let's show them this is how they're working boats, how they're used. These are some of the lovely details of how they actually fasten things together, which again, the engineering's perfect. Instead of just using screws and things, they're really tightly tied together in a brilliant way of lashing and then pulling that lashing tight at the last little bits of loops. There's a lot of clever things going on here. I don't want to spend too much time on that tonight because we could, it's going to take a while to get through all of this as it is. Luckily, I could see boats under construction, which again sort of reveals how it's coming together. You can see a lot from the outside and you can start to guess or estimate what's going on. I kind of know how to measure certain things and realise if you add the thickness of this and go down there, you'll find this particular key point or something like that. So I know how to get to certain things, but it's really reassuring when you've done a cross section to then come across someone building a boat and see, well, there it is. There's that rebate. There's how they join that in. There's the actual depth. It's a little bit more than I was guessing or a little bit less, something like that. But you start to see. And you also see, as you can from this top photograph here, that they actually set the boats up as we would. It's set up vertically. It's plumbed. It's not just sort of done roughly. Everything's done correctly. It's evenly set up at either end. They've set up what we call ribbons around it and basic frames to get the shape. And then the actual frames that they cut get dropped in there and fit so that then the planks will fit in a smooth curve. We would do exactly the same things. We've just got a lot neater bits of timber that we can use to do it. The tools were fascinating. They were old tools, but they were hand tools, a hand drill, beautifully sharpened chisels and so forth, and axes. Axes, the blades are actually made from leaf springs off cars and trailers and so on. So they had an endless supply of them they could make up. It really was really helpful to see. And these are photos from probably 2 or 3 different islands where we found boats being built at different times. At Utian Island, which is across the way from Panapompom in the Calvados, we came across a really big sailor. And again, they were happy for us to come ashore and measure that a little bit later in the morning. We did so, but the boat was actually sitting half in the water. And I said to them, that doesn't matter, I can work around that. They said, no, we're going to move that for you. And within a couple of minutes, there were 20 people down there. And we showed me what to do. You just get under the boat and put your back into it. And on a chart of whatever it is, you lift. So every third or fourth, whatever they said, we would lift and move the boat forward on rollers. And in about 5 minutes, we had the boat clear of the water set up. And then they left me to it. And you could see my tape measure off to the side here. I think the orange string line's pulled out there too. The string line is your datum. To draw anything, you need a grid. You need one datum line to start from, and everything can go from there. Because without that string line, I could not have done that. Didn't matter if it wasn't sort of plumb, absolutely level. I could figure that part out later. I just had to have that one straight pulled tight line to work from, and then I could actually relate everything in a sense back to that and produce those drawings. And again, take lots of detailed shots. I would take 30 or 40 shots of each vessel at least, showing close-ups of various things. And then I could again produce the drawings. So we're going to see all the drawings that I've done tonight, by the way. This is the lines plan of that big red boat. She's over 11 metres long, I think. That had a big capacity to it. We're talking over a tonne that these things basically displace, and they can carry a lot more than that, just sinking lower in the water. The water line, which is this line running through here, I chose a sort of protocol to work to for all the plans of making sure that water line passed through the washboard at either end. That seam one, from looking at the boats for a long time, that's a pretty logical place they're trimming at. And that's when the actually hull sits down fairly level in the water at that point. And then what you find is the outrigger is actually angled. And that's quite crucial to keeping the boat running straight. If the outrigger is dead flat in the water, it's going to tend to want to drag on that outrigger and pull itself up. But when they actually make it so that the outrigger is angled that way, it actually passes through the water with a very slight curvature as well. And that curvature kind of pushes the boat back down. So it kind of makes a natural balance against the boat wanting to come up in the wind because of the drag of that outrigger and the shape of the outrigger trying to turn it in the other direction. It's a very subtle thing. There are different versions of this done in the outriggers around the Pacific in the way that they get the thing to balance and track properly. But I thought this was a really interesting thing to be able to pick up on, because I'd found that someone else had written about these boats earlier. One of the things, and not all that long ago actually, he looked at those things and thought these are all cut with a curve. But what he was doing was seeing them sitting on an angle in the first place. When I pulled a string line down the middle of those, all the outriggers, they were dead straight. All they had was a slight sort of change to either side just because of workmanship. They're a little bit rougher on one side. Sometimes the dimensions seem to be about 10 mil or so shorter, but they would come back to be even. So it was nice to pick up on the fact that it's actually the angle they set them at that helps give that curvature and give that control, rather than actually trying to deliberately shape a tree in that direction. There's the structure of it. We almost called this boat an aircraft carrier. It seems so big to us, and this is only the second one we'd seen. I was able to record paddles, which was really good. They'd bring those things out, stand them up, and stand next to them at times. You can see subtle differences in the ends of the boat too. Again, I can pick all that sort of thing up. It's kind of nice to be able to do that. The schematics have everything looking even. These boats have got character relating to the piece of wood they use to build them from and so on. And there it is with its sail. They actually climbed the mast on this one to measure it for me. I didn't have any English, but I sort of said that. They grabbed the guy and he went up at the end of the tape measure. He stayed there for 2 minutes while I double checked it, and then he came back down. So I was able to record, because on a couple of boats I've had to estimate roughly what it is, but I was able to measure spars and things as well and get proportions. And I went to a pattern of drawing a sort of basic part of the boat to show all the different details of how it was put together. Then we moved further south and we came to Wanam Island, which is near Sud-Est, and we're pretty much down the end of the Calvados. We came across these boats, which were most unusual and we hadn't expected to find. The Kem Wingam Wingy, and I'll say that once and leave it. That was a really fascinating thing to find, because what had happened here was the people on these islands used to buy Solu, but they found they were getting charged too much for them, so they figured out, well, how can we make one ourselves? We've got trees, but they're only going to make small boats, so that's what they did. I'd come ashore here from the boat, which is moored some distance away, without realising that these boats are any different from anything else. I couldn't tell from the distance what it was. So I didn't have any tape measure or anything with me. So I quickly ran around and sort of pasted out and made some measurements off, my body height and various things, wrote all these notes down as quickly as I could, then went back to the boat and measured what my standard length of step was and things like that, to give me an idea of how these were proportioned, so that I could then do that drawing of one of these boats. They're a beautiful teardrop shape. I just love that shape of the hull. Carved out of a single piece. They've got some repairs in them where things have gone wrong later on. Very simply made. They've still got just a slight angle to the outrigger, because as the boat sits in the water and the outrigger sits up a little bit, it starts to lean back inwards a bit. And they made a lovely sort of picture, the two of them on there, one floating in the water and one pulled up on the beach. I thought that was a really interesting thing to find, because it was so unexpected. And the story of them deciding, well, these boats are too expensive, let's just make it ourselves. And that's what they did. And they raced them. We ended up here on St Clair's Day, which is real. It's a particular day in July. And they were having a regatta, and the winner of the regatta was going to get a pig, which is pretty good. And they turned up and they were going to do a race across the bay to the island, across the side and back again. It was pretty fresh wind out there. But we were lucky enough to actually be there and see this huge collection of boats. It was a lovely experience to be there and share that morning with them. Then we went on the second part of the voyage, which was the aim was to pick up the traditional cooler canoes. the epoy that comes from in the islands in the D'Entrecasteaux group. Then we went up to the Trobriands, where we were going to get to Dobu and Massawa, and then over to the Marshall Bennetts and on to Woodlark, where the Nagaga were. Now, all of this was hoped for. Even the fact that John knew that this particular boat up here was the one he'd seen in 2014. It was somewhere around there. He did a scouting mission while we were at Dobu and came back after 3 hours. I found it. Baluma East Village number 3, Ferguson Island. Let's go. So we did. And we went round there that evening and came back the next morning and actually met the builder who was there and the owner, and were able to record that particular boat. So here it is. John showed you some pictures earlier. There it is in its shed, which was really well set up. It was a perfect place to measure these things up, apart from all the sand flies and other bugs, etc. But you just work around that. And I was able to do a really detailed drawing of that and come up with everything, including details of the actual washboards and the wave splitter and so on, which we've also recorded in terms of photographs and so on. While I'm doing this, John and Harry are talking to the builders and to the people in the village and finding out stories about things and recording all of that. So we've got kind of both sides of it. I was there, do the technical stuff. If you can deal with that because we've got no idea how to do it, we can collect the rest as kind of the way that the voyage split itself up. And that's how we managed recording the information. These you can see, I think, straight away, if you can remember back to the Sailu, we're looking at a much narrower boat. In that area, the wind is a lot calmer, the area is a lot calmer. I actually paddled these boats quite a bit. I recorded at one point just where one of the seats was without putting them all in there. And this is ideal for paddling. It's a narrow boat. Makes it a lot easier to paddle something and keep it in a straight line. You can paddle the bigger ones, but you're not going to get the speed and the efficiency you'll get out of one of these. It's got a big log hull. That's kind of another good feature too for a boat that wants to paddle, and thinner sides, narrow. There's a lot of things, again, thought out correctly for what they're going to use this boat for, how it's going to be used, and the area that's going to be used in. Again, this report goes into that in a lot more detail to try and point out the differences in these boats. Actually, there's a lot of technical reasons why, and they're all absolutely correct. They are properly designed vessels, properly engineered for their particular task and for their area. And there is the side view of it. And it's got quite a small sail. You can see again that sailor had very big sails. Bigger boats, they can support more sail area. This is a much narrower boat. The righting moment, as we call it, the ability to keep the boat standing upright, is a lot less with a narrow boat. You can't put as much weight further out to the side from where the wind's blowing. So you can't carry as much sail, but you've got a narrow boat that's going to go fast anyway with a smaller sail. So here they are with their little sprit sail, the various connections. John showed us how the conch was used to bring up the wind. And when they're paddled, the boat's actually trimmed quite a bit to that side. So I was able to draw a cross section to show that. Then we were on to Catawba Island, where we found our first Tadobu. We actually got to sail on this one. Here they are bringing it out of the shed after I spent two and a half hours at the most measuring it up. And we took it sailing. This was one of the best things. We'd been for a sail on a sailor beforehand, but just sat in it and they'd sailed it for us. Two of us went out and we sailed with the rest of the crew, and we sailed it from where we measured it down to where they had a channel and we had our launch and so on. And then they took it ashore and said, oh, we'll take some of the kids for fun rides across the channel and back, which is half a kilometre or so wide backwards and forwards. So I sort of hung around and jumped on board when they started to go off sailing again, and realised that half the crew had taken advantage of the motor launch and tea available, and were around there having a cup of tea, which meant there was only half the crew there, which meant they're taking off and no one's got the main sheet. So I grabbed that, put it on the correct way around that they used to sheet it, pulled it on, looked at the guy who's steering it and said, is this right? He does that and says, we're away. So I got to actually physically sail the boat, which is really important to actually get a feel for what's going on and how they communicate and how you sort of ease things out to get the thing to sail in a particular way and work with them, steering it at the back with the rudder, which works in a very effective way too. That was just one of those golden moments that you can't plan, that just happened by accident. So we zigzag, or sort of not zigzag, just went backwards and forwards across the channel a couple of times, taking kids for sails, while I got to yank on the main sheet and get a feel of how the whole thing worked. Terrific stuff. And I got to draw it, of course, in the end. We can see here we've still got a boat with a very big log hull to it, just by that shape, how big that is. And it's wider though. There's a wider platform to it. You're in a more open area. They can sail longer distances to the islands that they trade to. They need a slightly bigger boat with a bit more freeboard to it. A whole lot of things are needed that they've done to make their boat different from what the previous ones. Very similar style and construction. I found a lot of common factors in the way the frames were done and shaped and so on. There's a lot of things done very similarly, but just done in a different way at each particular island for their particular style of canoe. There it is, sailing. I chose to draw that rig. There were two rigs they used. We went out with the big rig first, which was a big blue sail, but that got a tear in it. So they took that down when we got back, went back to where the other sail was and brought that along and set that up, which was this smaller black sail, and we went backwards and forwards using that. And I was really pleased to be able to draw that, because one of the things I wanted to show was how you repair things in a place like that. They're just using synthetic material for these sails that they can get from anywhere. We would go to Bunnings. Well, Bunnings doesn't exactly exist there, but they can get various materials. You can see the seams where the things join together in odd ways to get a shape. But there was obviously a rather major tear down here. That's all been repaired with rice bags. I just can't remember the name of that particular brand of rice. Oh, that one. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think you all know it. We've all eaten it anyway and survived on it. But I thought, this is fabulous. We can really get the details of how these boats are and how they exist and how they keep using them. They'll just do whatever they can. It's fabulous to see, because we need to keep these boats sailing. Then I found we had to stop at Eva Island and take a couple of people back who'd been in the medical centre at Catawba while we were there. And that was lucky, because the boat actually had a steering failure and we were stuck there for a night. So we went ashore unplanned and found this boat in its shed. And again, I didn't have a lot of time to measure it up, so I did a fairly quick measure, but got the essentials so I knew I can develop it from it. And this fabulous, long, lean, beautiful looking boat came out with these particular drawings. Lots of shells of decoration around its washboards. But this again showed me how they could sort of accentuate things and come up with a really fast, really interesting looking boat that's different on their island from what the other islands did, but still shares a basic concept of a big hull and a wider, slightly bigger shape to it. One of the interesting things on here was these connections through here that I'm showing on this cross section, where they've triangulated that. Again, they do a lot of things that are correct. To brace things properly, you actually do need to brace it with a triangle shape, or it'll start to move around. We use things we call knees in vessels and so on like that. But here they would do things by setting things up so that it was locked in with a shape that formed a triangle that made things rigid. Even the hull shape with cross beams across it and so on, locked all that in. But here, where these struts are actually vertical, they'll wobble quite a bit. They put a very strong piece across here, which is underneath every second frame, every second cross beam, and it's actually doubled. And that actually forms that really rigid connection. Again, the engineering is simple, but beautifully effective. And we found that on a couple of boats. And that's what it looks like under sail. In this case, I've chosen to draw the traditional sail. The spars were lying on the hull there, and I was able to measure them, but there was no sail evident, but I guess it would probably have been a synthetic one. But in this case, I decided, well, this is my one chance to draw something different. So I looked at the old black and white photographs and figured out how they would draw their normal sail, their woven sail. So I put that in there to show something a little bit different there. Then we moved on. Going back a little bit, on the earlier trip, we'd stopped at Ole Island on the way back and come across a Nagaga there. We kind of thought they might be there because that was the bottom end of the cooler trade. And they might have been one, and we'd been told that some might exist. Well, we found an abandoned one there. And even though it wasn't saleable again and was missing various bits, it was still really important to actually record. Because one of the key things, this boat's got a beautiful curved shape through it all the way through. What I'm finding, and you'll see on the next drawing of another Magaga shortly, is it's a lot straighter. This is the type of shape we saw in the black and white photos. These are the boats that they recorded back in the early 1900s with this beautiful shape to it. It's also got another very, very important thing to it. You'll see it's actually wider on one side to the other when you're looking fore and aft. And you can kind of see that here. This line out here is slightly wider than that one. That again is a kind of subtle thing that they're doing to help the boat steer a little bit better. And again, that's the leeward side. You want a little bit more volume on that side when it's heeling, so the water's not going to come in. That's one of the subtleties I'd hoped we'd pick up. I certainly found there was a little bit of unevenness in some of the lines, and that was just typical. It was going to happen. But this was something very, very deliberate, and I was pleased to see it on this particular boat. Again, it kind of makes me think that's how they would have been done very early on. And some of these things have been lost a little bit later on, some of the subtleties. So I recorded that as the lines plan and the structure, and it was missing some of the parts down here, which we'll come to on the next boat, which is one of the most key things in the construction of these Magaga, the way this mast step's created. But at least I had enough in there to show that, yeah, this boat was done traditionally. That's the way it was. It's missing a lot of bits and pieces that have rotted or been taken out. But I kind of know what they are from what other people documented. And as I found out, luckily I found the whole thing on a boat, which we'll look at in a moment. But it was great to be able to capture that, because they're the only two drawings I've done of that boat. But I've often thought I must come back to this and just recreate all the traditional rig and do a drawing of an absolute traditional boat as best I can. So what we did find later on, after we'd been at Ewa, we moved on to Gawa. And that's where we had the boat that we, in a sense, I'd certainly been wanting to find most of all, because I knew it had a very intricate structure to it. I knew it was one I really wanted to try and record and understand, because what I'd seen written about it from a previous thing, I thought, yeah, he's got all the bits there, but some of the engineering's not quite being described correctly. Maybe once I can see one of these things and get to talk to people, I can get a better idea of describing how it all works. So we found this, we got there that evening, went ashore, were able to speak to people and get permission to measure it up. And that reminds me, we always got permission. We always found who was the head of the village. Often that was done by our crew first and introduced. They said David was here, he was called the artist, because that's the only word they could think of that they would understand. And we wanted to do this, and they would say, yes, that's fine, he can do this boat or this or whatever. Come ashore at such and such a time, as that will suit us because of what else we're doing. And it was all worked out favourably. So with this, I had the owner and the builder on hand the next morning at 6 in the morning. And away we went and measured it up. And because it's shared, it's really difficult to show any photographs of it, unfortunately. But this is what it comes out as the drawing. Again, the lines, you could see from the top here, that top line, instead of having that deep curve to it, it's very, very straight. That's kind of a sailor influence, I tend to think, a more contemporary thing. The hull's quite a bit narrower. That's something we know that on Gawa they made narrower boats. That's the way they always did it. It's one of these sort of statements that we've found written up. Elsewhere they made wider boats, which makes me think that earlier one was probably built on Woodlark Island or somewhere else where they made the wider ones. But the big thing it had, you see how intricate all this area is down here around the mast step. You've got this part where the mast sits in it, then you've got this long curved mast arm, I've called it. It's got its own name, which we've recorded, but it's easier just to talk about it as a mast arm. That arm is then actually very rigidly connected to the outrigger. And this arm is coming through the middle of the boat here, and it's connected down to the outrigger. So you've linked up the main hull to the outrigger in a very strong connection. But the third part that comes into this is this spar up here, which is also this one here being curved around, and it's just a round part in cross section there. It's rigidly tied to that mast arm, but these ends here and these ends here are actually in a little loop of rope and are floating free. And what this particular thing here is a strain gauge. It is a device for showing the skipper and the crew whether the boat is actually overloaded how it's operating in rough water conditions, because it kind of moves a bit and it changes its shape a little bit. I could never quite get to the bottom of what it actually did. But I spoke to the builder, and then we were at different islands a little bit later, and I asked another builder, and his English was a little bit better. I got the same answer in two different sort of metaphors, but they basically said, without the netting, if the mast step would break, and it would be like if an outboard motor and its the conrod broke. I use that word conrod. If the conrod breaks, motor is kaput, motor will not work. If the mast step breaks, the boat will not work. They have a method of making sure they don't get to the point where that mast step is actually going to break. Now, I've never actually come across anything like this before. I don't have a huge experience of Indigenous watercraft worldwide, but I've certainly been through Haddon and Hornell to see what else was done in the Pacific. And I just cannot find an example of an Indigenous vessel carrying an item on it that can tell you whether your boat's actually overloaded and you need to change the direction you're sailing in the waves, or reduce the rig, or change something. In other words, you want to bring things back more under control. We do this on modern ocean racing yachts. That thing called Wild Oats that wins the Hobart race is loaded with material to record all the loads. They download it and look at it after the race to tell them what's happened, whether they need to fix something because it's nearing its use-by date. Here they've got it already done. And I don't know how long they've been doing it. But to be able to find that, to be able to record it and to be able to talk to people about it was really, really important. And I was so pleased that we actually found that. I remember when I finally got back on the boat, drawn the quick sketch up, not just that quick, but drawn my sketch up to make sure I understood everything. I thought, we've done it. We've still got 7 days to go. We've actually got all the boats. We've got the key boats. We've got the information at last. We can do this. And I'd kind of gone off, almost saying to people at work, yeah, I'm going to go and measure some canoes and produce some drawings and fly under the radar, without telling them we may not find too much, we may not, couldn't promise too much. And we were coming back with everything, and in some instances, 2 of everything, which I thought was fabulous. But to be able to put that together and to be able to document it and then try and write up the engineering of it is something I found as a really good experience to be able to do and to try and get it right. There's still things I don't understand, so you've got to go back. Lord knows when that'll be, but we've got to go back somehow. And there it is, rigged up. Again, I could measure the spars, but I couldn't actually measure the exact sail, so I kind of invented the sail as to what it would have looked like, something like that. But they set everything up. I could get enough photographs to show you how it was actually decorated. I think I've got the right number of fish there, but I'm never quite sure whether there was an extra fish either side of those things, those little motifs they put on there. And there, in this huge schematic there, is that really important mast step finally recorded, and showing where the key parts are. Again, yeah, it'd be nice to actually get out and sail on one of these and see how it works. But their descriptions of things gives me a fair idea of what's actually going on there and what to expect. So having got to that point, as I said, we'd sort of done it. But there are other things. I realised that, you know, these huts and shelters were quite important. They actually look after their boats very carefully in different ways. The hut on the top left there is the one where that big Masawa was, the big long one. On the right is where the Nagaga is at Gower. And down the bottom, we're back at Ferguson Island, Ballooma Village East, number 3, whatever it was. And they've got these more open huts that they store some of their fishing boats in, little fishing canoes, but also the big canoe, the big Epoy, was in one of those. So I'm aware there's architects around and I'll get criticised for the wrong terms, but I've done an architectural drawing. Again, one of the key things I wanted to show, this isn't just sort of cobbled together. This is set up really neatly. Everything's done in a way that it'll stand up, and they have braced it. They haven't had to go and buy those metal things you get at Bunnings again and whack nails in. They've just got a long spar and strapped it very carefully at either end. So the thing's rigid. When the wind blows, it's not going to blow over, blow backwards and forwards. It's going to stand up. The matting on here is done in a particular way that it's going to be watertight. The ends have got ventilation through them, top and bottom. I've taken the paddle off here, which has got a door to get in and out of. The boat's set up neatly on bearers. They're set up in a correct way too, so that one end is always facing the sea. you know which end that is, you know which way the boat's going to be orientated all the time. So I did that to make sure we at least recorded one of them. And then some of the smaller things I did was record a fishing canoe. There are a number of them around, but I just recorded one fairly simple one. Again, there's a lot of decoration in that, and we saw a number of examples of them. I'm mindful that we're getting close to the end of time here. But the other thing was these little village canoes, these sort of bicycles on water, for want of a better description. This is how they get around the lagoon, how they get around. They'll go and do some fishing in the evening or the morning, or move around the coast a little bit in a short distance. There's lots of these little things, but if you're someone like me, you can see straight away, hang on, they're a little bit different each time. Someone's doing something at one island, but they're not doing it at another island. They've all got their own sort of unique character. So I just kept taking photographs of them and sort of paced out a couple of them to get a rough idea of what they were. And thought, you know, I can do some drawings of these eventually. My favourite one was this one down here with the clear finish to it showing the grain. You get a fair number of dollars for that if you brought that over here to sell, I reckon. And the other favourite was this little one here, built for this little kid. That's an absolute delightful little thing to see, and he paddled out to see us. So I did that drawing, which is as many of them as I thought I could sort of cover, that showed the key differences between them. There's some of these ones down here, like out at Garwa and the Trobrands, they've actually put little washboards, splashboards and things on there, not with any particular carving to it, but they've given it the shape. They've gone that far. Whereas some of them are really simple, like this one. This is Willem with his Parramatta Eels jersey on. He was a boat builder, and I spoke to him a couple of times, went back on shore when we dropped back on that island the second time, and had a long talk to him about building the boats and getting to understand how they did things. Really, really helpful. And we exchanged food items and all sorts of things with the people, and with him as well. I think he ran off with one of my shirts. I can't remember which one it was, but I brought some lovely old t-shirts, some lovely t-shirts along that you'd never see. It looked pretty wild out there, so we're handing those things out. These were fascinating. There's that little boy's one. A couple of them actually did have rigs when we got out to Woodlark Island. But some of them were rigged up in a way that I watched these boats at Boargus village on Woodlark. They were sailing down with just by holding up a couple of palm fronds and drifting down with the wind that way. So I've done my best to record how that was done. And there were models. Now, without models, you're not going to get big boats, because that's where we all started. I had model boats, and look what happened to me. I found these two kids playing with this boat over off Panapompom. We went round to the next island, Navani, that's what it was. And they were just mucking around in the lagoon, taking it out in their canoe and then letting it go and having it run back in. So they let me have a play with it too. Again, I just took photos and had a quick idea of how long it was and came back so that later on I could actually do that rough drawing. And maybe one day I'll make my own carved model and see how it goes. But you learn a lot from models. You learn a lot of things. Here are some quick slides of just what we've got up to, and to remind you how beautiful the place is. There's Isabel doing a little bit of babysitting for mum, making some of the beautiful artefacts that you can buy in the markets. We would trade fuel and items, and that's the fish we got in return. There was traditional boat building, as we would call it, happening there. It just takes a lot longer. And then here's Harry, and there's John, and here's some of the elders talking about, there's probably a washboard or a splashboard on there. They're talking about the carvings and what it means and what the correct names are. We lived on bananas, and our washing was hung up the back to dry. Washing leads into the next one. There we have, on Boargus Village, a Hills hoist. And from Bunnings, or at least from the Bunnings catalogue, that's what we want, the bench seat. I just couldn't believe that. That's absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, it doesn't turn. I haven't got that part worked out yet. But these were some of the fun things we had. And my God, that sand was hot. I remember that too. The other thing I did was sketch my way around the place. These are just some of the little drawings I would do at the time, sitting in the cockpit of the boat as we moved along. I get an outline, and then when the boat settled, I'd fill it in later, and often have to refer back to my photos. That kind of gave me an advantage over Oswald, really. But then he often just sat with the boat anchored for some time and could draw away and get the details right then. We each have our methods of doing it. And we went to Coral Haven, which was important because that's kind of where Brearley started his artistic work. I got to see Coral Haven. Now, one of the things that wasn't there that they saw, because one of the things I did was compare, well, what did we see and what did Brearley see? We saw nothing that Brearley saw, and he saw nothing that we saw because he went in a different way. But what he did see, which was fascinating, was this boat that John had referred to, the Wagahot or Ialalu. And lo and behold, 2 years later at the museum, someone out of the blue offers one of these as a model to the museum, and it comes across my desk. David, you might know something about this. I sort of take one look at it and said, yeah, just leave that one to me. And they were happy to part with it. They collected it back in 2013, I think, when they were over there. And it was too big for their house and they were renovating. So suddenly we had a model of what they had recorded. And it's got all the right details in there, this beautiful mast step arrangement that they built on those boats back then. This was kind of the Louisiades version of the Nagaga. There's a lot of things that are similar, but there are a lot of subtle differences, and the model starts to pick that up. So I thought, this is brilliant. We've got something that I don't think anyone else has actually got. There's a model of one of these boats, a really genuine model with the rig, everything there. That's sort of a black and white of what they look like. Taken from the Wallace collection. So needless to say, I drew the thing up. I engineered a method by way I picked up the boat and brought it home and stuck it on the dining room table. And my wife gave me 3 days before it had to be out of the house, which allowed me to measure it up and then tell the museum, oh, by the way, I've got the model, we better bring it in. So there it is, I've been able to record that. To finish off quickly, we all got back there, or at least John and I did in 2019, to put up an exhibition. And that exhibition is very much thankful to Susan, who's here tonight, who took that photo, which is why she's not in it. Susan Abel and her trusty helper there, Roz, who was one of the key people that made all this happen, so that when John and I turned up, all we had to do was stick all the drawings up and the plans that the museum, my museum, had kindly paid for and shipped over there. They paid for everything. We set up an exhibition in one and a half afternoons, and then the Australian High Commission came down and opened it. It was absolutely fabulous to be able to bring all this back and bring all the community together. And hear people talk about the drawings. One of the key things was the feedback that we got. They were really pleased that someone had taken the time to actually do this and to do it so neatly and accurately that we now had, as what one said, there's a bank of knowledge here that we're never going to lose. You've captured our boats for us. There are people, well, we couldn't really do this in New Guinea. We don't have those skills, but you have. And the way you've drawn them as naval architects' drawings gives them true respect for the true value of what these boats are as properly engineered and properly designed boats. So we did that. And then I happened to engineer my 2-week stay there so that we could go to the Hoo Bay War Canoe Festival. You have to be there to believe it. There are only about a dozen of us as dim-dims there. And I think it should stay that way so that the community can just do what they want to do. And we were allowed in to observe and be part of it. That was really something special. And they demonstrated the boats afterwards. They don't actually race them, because when I talked to one of the village heads, he said, no, if we race them, we're going to tip them over. We still don't quite know how to make them go as fast as they can. But we certainly do things with them, and they demonstrated them there. Then the following weekend was the Canoe and Kundu Festival back in Milne Bay, and they really turned it on with the boats then. They had them all from the villages, all the villages. They went out almost to a point where you could barely see them on the horizon, turned around, and then in unison came charging back in. It was really something to see and hear and feel as they came and leapt out of the boats on shore. There's always dancing, another live pig, and so forth. That was one hell of a weekend too. That was exhausting, I remember. And I did manage to record 2 more boats. I just haven't had time to draw them up. There's other things that have somewhat got in the way, unfortunately. But 2 more boats that I hadn't found on the trip when we were there turned up. So I paced them out and measured them out one morning in the heat. And those drawings will happen. And my report will get bigger. So that's where it finishes, with the usual cliche shot of a sunset. Thank you.